Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, depending where you are in the world. Welcome everyone for joining us today for this 90-minute webinar. We thank Meta for sponsoring today's session, Navigating User Privacy in the Decentralized Social Web. I'll explain the title in a minute, but I first want to introduce myself. By way of introduction, I'm Stuart Dresner, founder and chief executive of Privacy Laws and Business, the world's most experienced information company specializing in this field, now in our 38th year. Thank you for joining us today. There are those amongst you who keep us up to date by subscribing to Privacy Laws of Business International and UK reports, as you will see. And we publish in alternate months in online, PDF and paper formats. Visit privacylaws.com/reports for more information. And thousands of our people download our news where we select the most significant subjects for your attention. Just over 3 weeks, we'll be running our 37th annual international conference from the 1st to 3rd of July. It's at St. John's College, Cambridge, a classic Cambridge college, which everyone loves to visit. And the conference title is Valuable Data, Priceless Privacy, where we have 82 speakers from 16 countries, including data protection commissioners, companies, law firms, and academics. And very few places remain, but you can attend, you can register the last few places or attend online. Now today, at this webinar, we've got 260 plus people who've registered from companies, law firms, consultants, regulators, and academics from 27 countries in Europe, the Americas, and the Asia Pacific region. Now, the webinar title is Navigating User Privacy in the Decentralized Social Web. And that looks a bit complex, but we have described the session more simply as privacy aspects of connecting and sharing across different social media. So the first question is, what is the decentralized social web? So the decentralized social web is also known as the Fediverse. This is a new term, but the idea is putting together of two words, the federated universe, which means that different social media platforms can be both independent and interconnected. It's an open network that lets people connect and share information across independent servers running on the same IT protocol. The Fediverse networks together individual social media platforms so you can post once on one of them and then share your post on other services. The term Fediverse is new to many people in the privacy world, including myself. Only first heard about it in March, I think, but the concept has existed since 2008, and one of our speakers will tell us about this initiative at that time. Now, everyone accepts the interoperability of services provided by different phone companies for about 100 years and email providers for around 30 years. And the Fediverse is another step along this path. So this is not only a private sector initiative. The European Data Protection Supervisor ran a Fediverse experiment to explore the concept. The core question we will address today is how and to what extent organizations can deploy the Fediverse in a way compatible with the EU's GDPR, General Data Protection Regulation. How will individuals retain their rights in such a connected environment as they are dealing with many different organizations, such as Mastodon, Mozilla, and WordPress, each with different terms and conditions? Now, we should make it clear the Fediverse is not owned by Meta or indeed anyone else. Everyone is in learning mode. I reckon, except the one who founded the Fediverse, of course, we have on the panel. I recognize that the Fediverse might seem scary for privacy advocates who will ask, how can I preserve my fundamental rights? Now, to guide us through this subject, I'm pleased to introduce today's distinguished panel. The chair is Palak Sheth, Head of Privacy Policy, Instagram and Threads at Meta, based in San Francisco. Do you want to wave? Yeah, right, that's Palak. And Palak works with cross-functional teams across the company to make sure that they are developing and building products in a way that's mindful of privacy and public policy concerns. A bit of background: prior to joining Meta, Palak served as the managing director of the Affirmative Litigation Task Force at San Francisco City Attorney's Office. There, she and a team, together with Yale Law School, developed cutting-edge consumer protection cases. So far from what one would imagine from what what Meta does. But anyway, she brings different type of perspective to the subject. So I think that's valuable. Our next speaker is Dr. Stefan Brink. Yes, that's right. Executive Director of Wida Digital based in Germany. Dr. Brink was a judge at the Administrative Court of Koblenz and later research assistant at Germany's Federal Constitutional Court, a very high-level position. And from 2008-2016, he was a commissioner for data protection and freedom of information in Rhineland-Palatinate, and co-edited 2 standard commentaries on data protection and freedom of information. And then from 2017 to 2022, he was a commissioner for data protection and freedom of information in Baden-Württemberg, and obviously as in that role as a member of the Conference of Federal and State Data Protection Commissioners, which brings together all of the 16 Länder commissioners. He's published many articles and runs his own podcast and a video series on digital freedom. And since January last year, headed Wida, the Independent Institute in Berlin for the Digitalization of the Working World. Turning to Ivan Prodromou, and he's a software developer and open source advocate, co-editor of ActivityPub, and based in Montreal, Canada. Now, Evan is the current editor of the ActivityPub at the World Wide Web Consortium, W3C, and it develops standards and guidelines that everyone build a web based on the principles of accessibility. So that chimes in well with our subject today. The W3C is this year celebrating its 20th anniversary, and he is the founder of Identity.ca, one of the first Fediverse sites, and created the Statusnet and Pump.io social network software packages. So he's a real founder and authority in this subject, and somebody who can really understand the IT network stuff, which I can't. Now, Willy Mikalef, based in France. You're a partner in Baden-Württemberg, a data protection technologies and communications group based in Paris. And Willy advises some of the world's most technology advanced organizations. His advice extends across the implementation of data protection and regulatory environments and the negotiation of contracts with a strong regulatory component. But when it moves on from advice and he has to tackle the authorities, he acts for clients in proceedings before the regulators and courts. He's also a professor of data protection and AI law at the Université Paris Saclay and Université Paris 5. And he's been recognized in the Financial Times Innovators Lawyers Report and Legal Advisors Who Open Doors for Pioneering Projects. So a very distinguished lawyer. Fuller biographies of our speakers are at privacylaws.com. Now, moving on to questions. The more questions and comments, the better. As I've said, this is a new subject for everyone except for Eva. And so I encourage you to take this opportunity to put your questions, however critical in tone you may think. Meta's a big creature, it can cope with critical questions or whatever. And we're all listening, and they want to hear what you have to say. Put your questions in writing in the questions section on the right of your screen so we can learn from all your perspectives. So type them in. You can't speak in this thing, but you type them in and you'll find that the questions when you think of them. The plan is to respond to them at the end of the webinar, but we put your questions in when you're ready. Now, we are making a recording of this session, so you'll be able to review it later at a later date, and we'll let you know when the recording is available. Now, that's enough from me. Over to you, Palak, who will introduce our subject, navigating user privacy in the decentralized social web.
Thank you so much, Stuart, and thank you everyone and our incredible speakers that we have today. We truly have experts across these issues that will be able to shed light on the critical considerations and privacy considerations in the Fediverse, but also the real values and spirit of the Fediverse and why there's so much excitement and buzz around the Fediverse these days. So good morning, good afternoon, good evening. With over 27 countries represented today, I'm sure we have all of the time zones here. Really quickly, I think, did something just change? Okay, so hopefully everyone can see me still. My name is Palak, as Stuart mentioned, and I am the head of privacy policy at Instagram and Threads, and also was part of the team that kind of built Threads from the ground up when we were deciding whether or not to make the app interoperable. When we first started working on this project, I did not know what the Fediverse is. And my goal for today is for everyone in the audience to really fundamentally understand what the Fediverse is and how we are all actually actively using and part of the Fediverse already. So I'm going to start with a few slides to kind of illustrate what I think help conceptualize this thing that's really, as Stuart mentioned, a federated universe, which makes it sound, huge and expansive and kind of endless. But actually, the diagram that I'm going to show you will help you kind of conceptualize how it works and really what the value and the purpose of it is, which is both to be expansive, but also to find your community. So let me start with that. And as I'm doing that, I just want to reiterate Stuart's point about questions and comments. Presenting a webinar virtually, and I think everyone can probably see my screen now. There's no way for me to see you anymore. So can everyone see my screen? I think so. Okay. So as I mentioned, having everybody virtual is not always easy, but I think to make this feel a little bit more interactive, if you can leave comments for things that you're engaging with that you think are good or you agree or disagree, and then also any questions that you would like the panelists to speak on at the end, there are tools at the bottom to do that. Use the correct ones. So here we go. This is a Fediverse 101, and you will all be graduating by the end of this webinar. But here we have what the Fediverse really is, which is short for, again, a federated universe. It's an open, decentralized social media network that lets users connect with and share information across independent servers. To communicate seamlessly, you can see this diagram on the right that has kind of big circles. Each circle is somewhat organized by media type. So at the very top, you'll see the word microblogging, and within that circle, you'll see Mastodon. Mastodon is by far the most kind of the largest and most known server within the Fediverse that looks akin to it's a microblogging platform. So it's really similar to X, formerly Twitter, or Threads, which people use for text-based dialogue. Next to that, you'll see PeerTube under something called like a category under video blogging. And that's similar to YouTube, which is video-based sharing. Next to that, you'll see PixelFed, which is image sharing, similar to Instagram. So the beauty here is you and anyone can sign up for any one of these individual servers. And when you sign up, you can choose to share in that specific medium or any medium, frankly. A lot of them support multiple mediums. And when you do, if Evan or Willy or Dr. Brink sign up for Mastodon and I sign up for PeerTube, but I go to follow them on Mastodon, I can, while within my own PeerTube server, consume their content. And also when I post content, if they follow me, they can consume my content. And the reason why they can do that and I can do that is because all of these servers are built using the same ActivityPub protocol. So that protocol is represented here by those blue lines that kind of serve as like the communication highway, if you will, that allows all of these different servers to communicate with one another, to share content across, and to speak the same language, if you will. And as I mentioned earlier, this is not a new concept in the world. This is novel, perhaps for Meta to engage with, and this is maybe novel for many of us. But at the same time, if we think about it, another example of a federated universe that we're all a part of actively is email. So as everyone here knows, if I'm sending an email if I use Gmail and somebody else uses Yahoo, I can send an email to that person with a Yahoo address. They will receive that email. And they can respond, they can delete it, and anything that they would like to do. And the reason why we can do that and interoperate with each other across different email servers is because they all use the same protocol, that being the simple mail transfer protocol. That really is the beauty and the benefit of the Fediverse, is that you can be on your own independent server of your choosing. But regardless of which server you choose, you can see content and share content across. And so again, as I explained earlier, being part of that really lean team at Threads and thinking about what we wanted Threads value props to include was that this idea that, you know, if we want it to truly be a place for public discourse and public dialogue, we knew that that's not only possible on one platform. We knew that the goal of connecting people to real public conversations is bigger than any one company. And with that, we decided we would make Threads interoperable by integrating it with the Fediverse. And we'll go into this a bit more later, but I just want to highlight, you know, when people often ask us, especially people that are new to the Fediverse, what's the value? What's the real benefit to me of doing this? And these are just a few of the values that I think we've highlighted and that we've seen that don't necessarily happen when you are in a closed network. So the benefits of really being part of an open social network protocol go beyond the ways that people can follow each other. They include things like you can reach new audiences. So if you're someone that is a power user and you're sharing your content on any platform, but you really want to expand that reach without having to go and post on every single individual place, you can do so by opting into sharing to the Fediverse, in which case anyone that's consuming content in the Fediverse will be able to see your posts. You can also find new communities. One of the things that I've really enjoyed learning about the Fediverse is that people join it not just for expanded reach, but really for niche communities to go deep on something they're really passionate about. You can discover and join more public discussions, and again, like you can do that across spaces that are otherwise limited. Each compatible server. Another benefit that I think really draws people to the Fediverse, and I think drew people to the Fediverse in the wake of kind of Twitter changing its leadership, is that you can set your own community standards and content moderation policies. This is obviously advantageous for many reasons, most of which being that people don't always agree with a certain platform's policies. Working at Meta, I'm very familiar with that. And this allows you to kind of not have to, right? I think this allows you the freedom to choose a server with which policies you agree with, or start your own server and dictate which policies you think should be the way that people speak on your platform. And at the same time, there's the latitude to also port over your content and port over your graph to different servers. And so that idea of transferring your profile from one server to the next exists in a way that allows for that freedom to move around and really give yourself the latitude that you want with your audiences and with your content. And then last but not least, it promotes innovation and competition. The idea being that, you know, if you are a Threads user today and ultimately you decide that, you know, you don't want to be a Threads user, you can leave and go to any one of the other servers that exist in the Fediverse, and that content that you've created and that will go with you. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing so that you guys can see everybody. And so we can kick it into the panel discussion. I do see that the chats are going off. I'm not able to read the chat messages while I'm presenting. So I'm hopeful that, you know, other folks are kind of responsive in the chat thread. One thing that I wanted to mention is that, you know, I have a few questions, and I said this earlier. I do have a few questions prepared for our panelists today, but obviously if the audience has questions, please do use that tool at the bottom. We will save time at the end to ask them. And so let's just get into it. I think that, you know, as I mentioned, we've really seen, I don't want to go as far as to say a paradigm shift, but we've seen a massive uptick in interest in the Fediverse in the last year and a half, roughly since November 2022. And it's really clear that content creators and just individuals building their online communities are interested in reaching audiences across apps and beyond whatever app that they're specifically using. Evan, I'm so grateful that we have you, again, the author and co-author and editor of ActivityPub, here with us today. As someone that is, you know, probably one of the earliest Fediverse enthusiasts on the call today. What you believe are the benefits and the use cases of the decentralized social web.
Yeah, I think you hinted at it. First of all, thank you so much. I'm really glad to be here today. Great to be on this panel with so many people who know so much. I think one of the most important aspects of the Fediverse is that distributed locus of control. We no longer have a single platform that is operating all the apps and all the services. It's distributed to different platforms, different operators. That gives us a lot of benefits. One of them is some effective competition. If you are you mentioned being an influencer or someone who is a content creator, and you don't feel like the terms of your platform make sense for you in terms of ad revenue or in terms of payment or reach, you can change and move somewhere else where those benefits are more advantageous to you. So we're introducing some market forces into social networking. The counteracting forces that have always been there, that if you build up a following on one service, you go back to zero when you move to a new service. We're dropping that inhibitor, that disadvantage, and I think that's a really big advantage for folks who participate in the Fediverse. It also allows us different kinds of business models, right? So to the extent so far that we see social networking, we have largely our social networks are based on ad-based business models, ad-supported systems, but that's no longer a necessary part of social networking. So it could be software as a service that's provided by a SaaS vendor who just says, pay us some money every month, and you've got a social networking presence. Can also be open source, installed on commodity services, which is the Mastodon leading mechanism. The other thing that can happen in this world is that it's not necessarily commercial operators. You could have operators that are different kinds of entities. I have a Mastodon server for my household, for myself, my family, my kids. Their professional organization that I'm a part of, the ACM, which is a distinguished computer science organization, runs a Mastodon server for their members, right? And there are civic organizations, cities that run services for their citizens. So we're also changing the type of operator that we see in the world. It's not only tech companies. I think on the end user side, and you kind of mentioned this a little bit before, there is that FOMO that we say, fear of missing out, right? Like when new services happen, when new networks launch, where you have to make a choice between staying on the platform that you already know, staying connected to people that you already know, or moving on to this new platform and connecting with friends there, right? So you can kind of be torn between networks or maintain multiple networks, right? A lot of us have accounts on many social networks, 3, 5, 10. Being able to have one social network account and stay connected to people on other networks, honestly, great for our mental health, great for our anxiety levels, right? We can all just kind of dial down the number of social networks we feel the need to push into. A last one that I think is important on the business side is that there's a big barrier to entry in creating a new social networking business, right? You can create great new filters, beautiful new video editing, but on day zero, when you launch your application, you have 0 members, right? You have 0 people participating, and you actually have to spend a lot of time and energy getting up to 100,000 users, 1 million users before it becomes really useful for people. The Fediverse gives us a chance to have new software coming onto the system, and on the first day they have access to tens of millions or hundreds of millions, a big audience, instead of starting it from scratch. A last real benefit that I want to talk about for platform vendors is there's a lot of pressure if you are a platform vendor to maintain this kind of open agora. You are responsible for the public square, right? And so when you have problematic users who are causing issues, there is some responsibility to say we're going to maintain that person on our service because otherwise they will have no voice. The Fediverse gives operators a chance to be a little bit more discriminating or discerning in what kind of users they platform, because they do have a choice. They can just say, hey, there is a place on the Fediverse for you, just doesn't happen to be here, you know, and you can take your followers and you can take your content and it all goes with you, but we don't want to be the platform for you. So that's another option, is that, you know, kind of counterintuitive, but it does let platform operators make a lot more choices about the kind of communities they're supporting. Hopefully, what, 5 or 10 benefits covers it. I wonder I wonder if there are others that people on the call have thought about in this kind of structure.
Yeah, and if people who are listening in, if they want to share other benefits that they've gotten from their experience or on the Fediverse, or why they've chosen the Fediverse, please feel free to share. I particularly liked a few of the ones that you just mentioned that I hadn't thought of. We've talked about, you know, like the Fediverse, again, it's so elusive. You don't really know who we're talking about, but what I'm learning is that it's a lot of really passionate people about specific interests that want to talk about that interest with the community. It's not necessarily a community that they know, so they want it to be anyone across the internet that also is passionate about that community.
Yep.
That's one thing. You mentioned governments and organizations, and, you know, creating spaces where they feel like they're in control of the content moderation and the type of conversation that's happening. There's also, I've heard from different publications, including the BBC, that something that they post elsewhere on other platforms versus something that they post on their BBC Fediverse server will get a lot more engagement, because they're attracting the exact people that are really interested and curious about what they're posting about. And so they've been able to find, you know, you get deeper, better conversation with the community that you're kind of actively building. And I think that, to me, is probably one of the most beautiful parts of the Fediverse. In addition to kind of something that you mentioned that I don't think about as much, which is the ecosystem impact, right? And so really, like, software providers, app developers, and things like that, where can you go to kind of launch something and see how, and get a pulse for how it's received, that's really public, and at the same time not limited by, you know, not limited in the same ways that it might be on elsewhere.
Yeah, I think that for app developers who have invested in a big platform, so, you know, they've built an app that uses that platform, and they really build in the platform rules to their app, when those rules change, it could wipe out their entire business model, right? And so having a chance to say, hey, this app works across different social networks, and if this social network over here no longer wants to let us, you know, post videos, etc., you can do it other places, and it gives some robustness to that ecosystem, instead of being so dependent on single platforms.
Fantastic. So now that we've discussed these benefits, you know, the real focus of today's conversation, and what I'm very excited to dig into with both Dr. Brink and Willy, is not just this paradigm shift that we've been talking about towards interoperability, but really the key privacy considerations for the decentralized social web. I'm excited that we will all be hearing kind of best practices in ensuring users' data protection rights, and how they can be consistent with the real philosophy and ethos of the Fediverse. So my first question to dig into this topic is to ask, and we can start with you, Dr. Brink, what are the key privacy considerations in an interoperable decentralized social network? And then after you share, we can go over to Willy.
Fine. Thank you very much. First of all, thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure to talk to all of you. When you think about data protection issues in the decentralized social world, there are at least two main questions. The first question is, what's the legal basis for data processing in the Fediverse? And the second question is, what are the special features or special problems of decentralized social networks? And well, let's have a short look at this. First question, what's the legal basis to process data in the Fediverse? And that's not a big problem. You look at GDPR and you'll see Article 6. There are various legal bases for the processing of personal data. You can either process it on the basis of users' consent. It's Article 6A, or you can think about a contractual basis. That's 6B. It's also conceivable to work on the basis of legitimate interest, 6F. That's you might think about that, but it becomes difficult if you think about tracking. Even in the Fediverse, it's not excluded that you have some issues with that. And so if you think about the strict case law of the European Court of Justice about tracking, if you remember the case Meta versus Bundeskartellamt in July 23, all legal bases except consent can be ruled out, but consent is okay. You can build on this topic all the Fediverse world. So the second question that's much more important, what are the special problems of decentralized social networks? One might think that decentralized social networks are very advantageous from the point of view of data protection, and in particular from the point of view of the supervisory authorities. This may also be the case with only limited or no tracking at all. However, decentralized social networks have special features that make them more difficult under data protection law, since it is a network of providers and not only one provider. It's difficult sometimes to determine who's responsible and to assess the trustworthiness of a network. Trustworthiness already plays a major role when it comes to the question of which instance the user should register with, especially as the instances are networked and even one problematic provider can infect the entire network. In addition, all instance operators pursue a common goal, which is why they are to be classified as perhaps as joint controllers under Article 26. This requires a contractual agreement between the controllers and the distribution of the tasks and the protection of data subject rights. This agreement is already difficult to conclude in practice because the operators don't always know each other. You can see that there too, a shared responsibility is often not a solution, but more of a problem. It's also evident when it comes to transparency issues. According to Article 13 GDPR, every controller must provide comprehensive information about the processing of data. Here too, the problem with decentralized networks is that not every controller has a complete overview of the entire network, which is why they cannot provide complete information. And in the end, there's even might be problems with data security. Each responsible party must ensure sufficient data security so that the network is not taken over by third parties and users and communication data is secure. Decentralized networks certainly have advantages in attack situations, as hackers can only ever attack a few responsible parties and the network can therefore continue to function. This is ultimately the whole idea of the internet as a robust platform. Conversely, however, the data security measures in networks always vary in strength, which makes it easier for attackers to find weak points. This is where uniformly implemented measures in a centralized network can be an advantage. So you see, decentralized networks have their own problems that data protection has to deal with, but I'm quite sure that we will always find good solutions.
Thank you for that. And I know that some of the things that you've raised just now are exactly what we're thinking through, and how while we are, being pushed for more interoperability, and we hear that coming from many EU regulators, there's also some considerations before we can just turn on an interoperability switch, because there are some of these challenges, as you mentioned, that raise concerns that are not easy to kind of build controls for, build tools for, and frankly require additional education and transparency to the average user to understand what those limitations are and what their options are for protecting their data and protecting their online experience. Willy, I'd love to hear from you. Obviously, with Dr. Brink, we're getting a former data protection authority himself, so we're going to hear that real, viewpoint, which is hugely advantageous for us to have this conversation. But I would also love to hear from you and your perspective as a data and policy expert.
Thank you very much, and I'm very delighted to take part in this discussion today about the Fediverse. And hearing all of these views makes me also feel reassured in my feeling that Fediverse is compatible with GDPR's philosophy, and in particular, hearing it from Ivan, because one of the key questions about the Fediverse is whether it is compatible in itself with the GDPR philosophy. And the fact that the Fediverse is empowering users like never before, I think is a proof that it is in line with GDPR's philosophy. I'm not denying that there are clear compliance challenges, and I fully agree with Dr. Brink's comments on transparency, but also on security. But it's important to note that the Fediverse decentralizes digital power, and it promotes user autonomy and privacy. And this is why I'm saying that not only it complies with the GDPR overall objective, but also with the more recent data laws adopted by the EU, and I will come back on this. But first, on the GDPR, I think that what is important to note is that the notion of user control is central in this text. When you read its recitals, when you read recital 7, where it is clear that individuals should have control over their personal data, but also when you look at what was the objective of the EU legislator when they created a new right for data subject, that is the data portability right, it was clearly to empower users. The objective was that a user could become a player in its own digital consumption and make its accumulated data stored on existing platforms available to benefit the new platforms they may wish to use. And Fediverse clearly serves this objective. And when you look at the practice of the data portability right, which is honestly complex to understand and to exercise, we observed a limited appetite from data subject for this right. And in its first evaluation of GDPR in 2020, the European Commission also noticed it. And Fediverse here is an opportunity to reach the same objective, but in a much more simple, intuitive, and user-friendly manner. And this is why I think it's really, in alignment with the overall objective of the GDPR. And it's also in alignment with the more recent EU data laws, which have set out interoperability obligations on major tech platforms. It was something we used to know and to apply for traditional federated network industries like the telecom. And the EU has started to implement this in the digital space. And clearly, again, the Fediverse also contribute to interoperability. So that is clearly the first point I wanted to make. And then one also very important point is, what are the role of the different stakeholders? And Dr. Brink also mentioned this issue. The interconnection of social networks raises the question of who is responsible for what. And to try to, assess what is the legal status of the different stakeholders, it's important to understand how it works and kind of make analogies with previous decentralized network. Because Fediverse is a decentralized network, which is a situation where many independent service providers speak to each other in a process known as federation, so that even people on different providers can still communicate. And although the Fediverse will have, for sure, a revolutionary impact on the way people use social networks, the idea of the Fediverse is not revolutionary in itself. Federated networks have been around for ages. We have all been using them. Postal services, telephony, or email, the example that you gave earlier, are exactly examples of decentralized networks. And in my view, these independent service providers decide on their own the why and the how they process personal data of their users and the users from third-party servers. And in this context, my view is that they kind of act as independent data controllers. And the mere fact that two Fediverse providers use the same protocol to interconnect does not make in themselves joint controllers. And if we make an analogy, for example, with mobile telephony networks, two mobile operators are not by nature joint controllers just because to interconnect with each other, they use the same mobile telephony protocol. And I think it's kind of the same logic with the Fediverse. And it's interesting to note that there has been a precedent in the EU. There was a pilot of Fediverse on EU Voice. And it was an initiative of the EDPS. And it was clearly the approach taken by the EU institution. They considered that each server would act as an independent data controller on its own data processing operations. And from there, everything comes in terms of GDPR compliance. Every data controller is responsible for information, exercise of data subject rights, setting out the right, security measures. And finally, just on governance and data governance, it's important to note that, of course, there is a question of whether there should be or not an overarching supervisory entity. First, the law in itself does not explicitly require it. It's not a black letter law requirement. And also, when you look at how the Fediverse works, when you look at its unique structures and the way in which it promotes community and localized governance, I think that the idea of having an entity supervising the system is kind of contradictory with the core idea of the Fediverse. So this is why, although the debate is clearly legitimate, I don't believe in an overall entity supervising the system.
That was fantastic, Willy, and thank you so much. I think you draw so many, you're able to connect kind of like the GDPR and the privacy design of what we want to get out of social networking and how it can actually function well within the Fediverse, and actually perhaps how the Fediverse empowers some of that same spirit of user, or uplifts the idea that users should be central to having control over their information, and that data portability exists within the Fediverse in a way that is consistent with GDPR. I want to make sure that, we have such a great panel of speakers that you're all also able to respond to each other and what each other are sharing. I would love to make this a bit more of a conversation as much as we can vis-a-vis a webinar. But I'm sure you all have thoughts as to how each other's kind of interpreted that question. So please, if anybody wants to respond.
Yeah, I want to, I'm going to jump in here because I do find it really interesting. I think that there are two models of federation that we've discussed here. One is one with a very formal relationship between operators, say a contract necessary between operators to share data and to connect to one another. The other is more of an open system in which any new operator can join the network without necessarily having to have, any sort of bilateral agreements with everyone else. I think that second model is the one the Fediverse works on right now. I think it's the one that is the most generative in terms of giving us a lot of opportunity, right? The first one is slower and perhaps safer. The second one is maybe a little bit wilder, but it also allows a lot of generative work to come out of it. I think Pollock talked about email earlier on as a model, and that is the model of email is towards that second mode, right? Anyone who creates an email server can set it up and send email to other users around the world without having to sign a contract with Google and Yahoo and Microsoft in order to send mail. I guess my big question is, how is email seen in a GDPR framework? And is that a good model to look at the Fediverse? And that might be a question for Stefan.
Absolutely, yeah. It's a good question, and there you can see that many questions we are discussing now regarding the Fediverse weren't discussed at all with the other much earlier attempts to communicate with each other. The problem of Article 26 of joint controllership was, at my knowledge, never discussed when you're talking about the connectability of email providers. So on the other hand, we have decisions of the European Court of Justice, who's really trying to push the debate towards a more controlled and perhaps even a less free working together of these networks. But I totally agree. There are two models, and it's not yet clear which one will make the game.
Maybe just on emails, it has been debated for ages, and also the determination of the role of the different stakeholders with regard to a communication in general. And there has even been at some point some very old guidance saying that it was the individual who wrote and decided to initiate a communication or send an email that could be potentially qualified as the data controller, and the operator just transmitting the message would be a mere transit provider until it stores and processes the communication for its own personal purposes. So this has been debated, and for sure the same tricky questions will also be posed in the context of the Fediverse. But it really highlights that it's again the same questions to a different environment, and we already have the tools to answer them. And it also shows that GDPR, notably, we are talking a lot about GDPR, but probably we'll be able to talk about CCPA later. But GDPR is a technology-neutral legislation, which is, made to apply to this new environment. And it's important to say this because for the moment, Fediverse has been used by small players who may fear that bigger actors are entering into the game. I don't think that this will trigger new legislation which over-complexify the Fediverse, just because as regards data protection, GDPR is always fit to adapt to new technologies or new contexts. So I don't think it should be a concern.
These are hot takes. And I think that they're really interesting ones, as well as the ones that are coming through the chat. We have a good number of questions left to go, but I just wanted to raise a few points that were raised that I think are interesting in the chat. I mean, first and foremost, I think there's just a fundamental kind of understanding that, yes, email is technically a good comparison to the Fediverse because it works in the same way with regards to independent servers and with protocols. However, the spirit of email these days is that there are really a few major players that most people use, right? Most people are using a small number of servers, and it's very hard to kind of develop your own email server. People do it, but it is very hard. And part of why it's very hard is and why people use the main ones is because the significance of the spam filtrations that exist on those kind of more commercial email entities. And that's something that we will likely encounter in the Fediverse as well. Evan, you mentioned that, I don't know, I think there's over 20,000 email servers, maybe 27,000, Fediverse servers, many of which are operated by volunteers that are the ones administering kind of their content moderation tools and policies on their server. When issues arise that are massive issues, like how spam has arisen in email, which is a massive, I think there's some data point that I read somewhere that said 70% of emails are actually spam, but most of us don't see that because the email server we use is filtering them out. So I think that, it's a useful comparison to some degree because it helps explain the technological similarity, and it's also not as useful in other ways, the email and Fediverse comparison. So that's one. And then the other one I just wanted to highlight that is here, I think Ashley mentioned, and I really like this point because I think she's right. She said something along the lines of, there's a really good opportunity, or perhaps there may be a really good reason to sort of insert new extensions into W3C to allow for better data subject rights within and controls within the Fediverse. And I think this is interesting and probably something that we might not have time to speak on today, but really it feels like with more kind of gravitational pull towards interoperability, more gravitational pull towards a federated social network, are there opportunities for us to provide tooling within the protocol that addresses some of these GDPR considerations, so that, while we don't need to adapt and create a new regulation, as you just mentioned, Willy, it's technologically agnostic, really. That's the goal of it. Maybe there are ways that we can do that so that all the servers can make sure that there are tools that are permitted to all of their users to help develop that sort of protection that is what we're looking for. We spent a good amount of time on GDPR. Actually, the next question was going to be, ActivityPub was presented by the W3C in 2018, which is in fact the same year that GDPR went into effect. We kind of answered this question in how you've seen, or what we think, how the GDPR can work within the Fediverse. But I'm just curious, given that the Fediverse has existed for some time, are there any examples, either to Dr. Brink or to Willy, of how you've already seen it apply in the Fediverse?
Not an easy one. I don't know, Dr. Brink, if you have any idea.
Well, I think one of the things you already mentioned, right, is that the EU voice, right? The European Commission put together its own server. How do you think that they were able to do so in a way that is consistent with, obviously, with GDPR?
Well, I mean, they have produced interesting documentation on how to comply with the GDPR, which for sure will be relevant for the evolution of the Fediverse. I think that first, on transparency, they have been able to produce, in their capacity of data controller, a kind of rather comprehensive information notice that could serve also as a kind of template, in particular in the way that it was not only targeted to the registered users of their own servers. It was really making clear what they were processing from users and contributors to third-party services, which is a key issue. How to inform and how to provide meaningful and complete information to users of third-party services to which your server is federated. So that's a very good and interesting example of compliance with the transparency principle with this prior EU pilot. There were also some kind of procedures for the exercise of data subject rights, which were kind of efficient as the data which was stored on the server of EU Voice, just because this is where you have control. The question is how you do implement right to deletion when you are federated to a variety of other servers. And here I think that there is clear progress to do. By improving the protocol, but also the cooperation between the different servers, and also about focusing on user education. Because in the end, I think that the Fediverse is a bit like Web 0.20. You should use it in consideration of the fact that, what you post is is forgotten with difficulties. And although we will improve, the cooperation on the right to deletion, in particular when one controller has contributed to making available to others some data which are subject to a right of deletion request, you can set your profile to be protected. You can limit, the reach of a post. And therefore, you can limit the distribution of your content, which will be extremely useful to ensure that you keep the control over your personal data. So the way we handle data subject right in the Fediverse must clearly be linked to proactive actions on user education.
I want to jump in and just give a really quick note about data deletion, because it is, I realize it's very technical, but it is cogent to the discussion, which is, say if I posted a photo from my vacation photos and it went to my server, if the three of you followed me, that photo would get copied to each of your servers. If I decided that I don't like the way I look in this photo because my eyes are crossed and the background is fuzzy, I can delete the photo on my server, and a notification goes out to each of your servers. Evan has deleted this. There is, so it's a notification-based system. Because of the distribution of control, there's no way for my server to, force a deletion on any other server. But it is a best practice, so to speak, that those deletions are recognized and acknowledged, and the photo is no longer available to anyone else. So that is kind of the structure. That also happens with edits or changes to a photo or text or video, etc. That gets sent back out to the to all the followers.
Go ahead, Dr. Brink.
Yeah, thank you, Eben. That's a very good example how you can try to work with the user rights from GDPR. There are other topics regarding GDPR and networks, even decentralized networks. Let's have a look at the principle of data minimization. That's extremely interesting. The principle enshrined in Article 5 GDPR that, of course, also applies to all networks, even to decentralized. But it's often misunderstood, this principle. And some data protection authorities like to get it wrong. Data minimization does not mean that we should strive for a world in which as little personal data as possible is processed. That's not the point. That was abolished with the GDPR. There have been some regulations in Germany who said, well, only dead data is good data, only deleted data is good data. But that's no longer the point with data minimization. And Article 1 of GDPR makes absolutely clear that the free movement of data, including the trade of personal data, may not be restricted or prohibited by reasons of data protection. Data minimization means nothing more or less than the principle of necessity of data processing. Data that is not required to achieve the set objective may neither be collected nor stored. And this is a rejection of untargeted data retention or internet scraping with any ideas, but the GDPR is not fundamentally opposed to the processing of personal data, even in large quantities, and especially not on this decentralized social network level. So we find solutions under the GDPR. I'm absolutely convinced.
That's very helpful and illustrative of how actually data minimization isn't what some have interpreted it to be. I think the point that both Willy and Evan are raising, both around data deletion and really user protection, is education, right? I think that the idea is that there are limitations, as we mentioned, and these limitations do kind of change what you would expect and perhaps change what we would be able to regulate under GDPR for data subject rights. But the idea around deletion technically in the Fediverse, as Evan illustrated, is that it's technically not as easy to post something on one server, send that deletion request to another, but by the decentralization of it all, you can't guarantee that that post will be deleted on that other server. On Threads, I know that one of the things that we're very, very, very focused on is, one, it is an opt-in to share to the Fediverse. We don't necessarily think that everyone should be opting into this. This is something you should be doing with full understanding of what's happening to your information and your data. Two, a commitment to send that deletion request every time you delete any specific post. And three, awareness and transparency around the fact that despite sending that request, it may not be respected, right? It may not actually be deleted. Now, this is something that is a risk. I want to flag that this feels like almost an incremental risk to what exists today with Web 2, in the sense that if I post something and I'm public, right, today, or if I post a blog on a post on my blog, that can easily be screenshotted and shared elsewhere and infinitely. In the same way that when I post something, and even if I delete it today, it's already shared to the Fediverse. And if that separate federated server doesn't delete it, someone can reply to that post. They can continue to share it indefinitely. So the key here is really user education and understanding, both with the current risk that we're already living in today, the reality around screenshots, the reality around embedded content. And then second, the incremental increase in that risk and the responsibility that each individual server has over their own platform, but also, where do we as platforms want to be in communication with each other? What sort of level of respect do we have for each other's platforms in responding to that request? We've spoken a bit about GDPR, and we've spoken a bit about kind of like best practices. Do you think that there is any additional best practice that we haven't covered today in terms of protecting user data? Evan, I'll start with you. I think you did cover some of this, but if there's anything else that you think that maybe you haven't been able to discuss here, I think it's important for users that are actively part of the Fediverse to kind of know.
Yeah. So Willy covered a few of the things that I think are really interesting. One is having multiple privacy modes, right? So I can publish a photo to the whole world or just to my close friends, and that is, within the system is maintained, and so that is and that's actually a configurable mechanism. So you can make that even stronger in different ways. It's a very flexible system technologically. The other best practice, I think that's fairly common, is caching of content and notifications, right? So when I talked before about how when I post a photo, it would go out to everyone else's server, typically on my server, it gets stored for, ad infinitum, right? Because I want to be able to go back and look at it, etc. On your servers, much more likely to be cached for a small amount of time while it's still relevant, relatively new, and that cache is typically flushed, on days or weeks basis. And I think that is it's an interesting aspect of the system, but somewhat different level of storage between my server, which I expect to be authoritative, to store my data, to keep my data for a long time, versus your servers where you have kind of a short-lived copy of what I've made, right? And I think that those are two different structures. The last thing is, you know, in terms of best practices, it comes down to, you know, governance, right? So each of those servers is going to be run by somebody, and that somebody needs to be aware of and practicing good privacy. Sometimes the organizations that are running it are going to be very involved with privacy, right? Very aware of the privacy implications. Others may be, you know, so say a family server. I'm not a privacy expert. I run a server for my my wife and children. If they provide me with a GDPR right to deletion notice, I'm going to have to, you know, look up what to do there. So different, definitely very different profiles in terms of who's operating servers, and you know, the information there is probably pretty important too. And maybe that's a technological thing where there's a lot of affordances built into the system to make it easier for them to maintain. Maybe it's user education, etc.
All right, thank you. That's helpful. And I think also consistent with kind of like what we're learning about users' understanding of the Fediverse today. And the idea that, again, this idea that it's decentralized and that there are different servers and different servers require different amounts of time and caching. I think that's all very technical and not user-friendly per se. But in theory, this goes back to this idea that individual server operators really have control over how their server works and who they're interoperating with. And that is kind of like the level of, you know, that is really the spirit that I think is what's probably most important to protect within the Fediverse, right? Among Fediverse users and Fediverse enthusiasts, the idea that decentralization and decentralized governance is actually very much, I would imagine, like the primary kind of like unique difference and vision for the Fediverse that's different, and that what people are starting to gravitate towards. Outside of what I think these best practices that you were able to share illuminate, I think, you know, there's a role in this that, you know, we haven't talked about. So there's the role of current regulations and how we can kind of make sure that operating in the Fediverse is either consistent with that, or we've interpreted whether it is consistent with that. Willy has his take. I think Dr. Brink kind of shared his. And then also where there are gaps in that consistency, or where there are potential gaps, the uptick in responsibility and transparency and education before someone chooses to operate in the Fediverse. Are there other, you know, roles that you all think that users play that we should kind of be taking our, you know, self-responsibility in ensuring our own privacy in the Fediverse? I like how Willy earlier said that, you know, the GDPR is really, it really puts user control, really puts user control as central to the purpose of GDPR and empowering users to have data portability and control over their data. What else is the role that really users play in this? And how can they be encouraged to take more of an active role, frankly, in protecting their personal information and being empowered? And this is open actually to all of you. So whoever wants to kind of jump in first.
Maybe I can say a few words about it. First, there will be a variety of different users. They may not be all comparable. They may not also use instances which are themselves comparable. There is one interesting question on the users with moderation rights and their roles in terms of GDPR compliance, given the responsibility that they will have on the server. They might qualify as controller, or a joint controller with the instance administrator or even processor, and there are some consequences in terms of GDPR compliance. So it's important to talk also about this very specific category of users. And more generally, you see that this initiative, the Fediverse, come from the people, and people who have, I think, a special interest in user power, user autonomy, user privacy, and it is also their responsibility to make the system as a whole more privacy friendly. And they will also contribute to user education. It's, I think, not only the responsibility of server administrators, and it's really why I'm enthusiastic about the Fediverse. It's the matter of all, which is very interesting from a GDPR and privacy perspective.
Excellent, thank you. And I would love to hear both from Dr. Brink and Evan as well. In any additional kind of, we came together and we thought it was important to have this webinar because there is and I think there's just kind of like I don't know if it's a groundswell sense that maybe I'm feeling because I've been working on threads, that people want to have more agency over their content, that they want to have more freedom in porting their information over from one place to the next. That, we saw what happened with Twitter, and people spent decades building their communities and building their business in some instances, and then feeling like, oh, we don't actually have control over what happens with all of that, everything that I built when somebody comes in and perhaps changes the rules. And so with all of that happening, we wanted to have a conversation because the reality is, while GDPR exists and it obviously regulates countries within the EU, the Fediverse also exists in the EU. They've been both consistently existing, frankly, since 2018, since the GDPR has been in effect. And so I think today and after today, the conversation that I'm thinking about going forward is if more and more individuals see the Fediverse as a place, perhaps for greater data privacy, right? For more empowerment over their data, with at the same time acknowledging that it is decentralized, that there's no body that really is going to be able to control every single admin of every single server. How do we square these two tensions? Do we feel like we've resolved some of that in this conversation? Is there anything that you think that that we should be asking ourselves and writing about, frankly, going forward, so that we can have a thriving federated world and social network in the EU, as well as obviously the rest of the world?
If you like to answer, otherwise I would tell you about my point of view. I think we have to change our mind regarding the purpose and the function of data protection. It's in most cases our point of view is much too defensive, or the users want to play an active role. They want to use their instruments to not only they don't only want to know their rights, but they want to do it in a more positive way. So when we talk about data protection, I prefer the words of our constitutional court. It's not talking about data protection. It's talking about freedom of informational self-determination. It's a long phrase, but it's a very active role. It's self-determination. And that's the point where the Fediverse can really help us, because data protection as a freedom issue cannot only be restricted by any government acting in an aggressive or negative way, but it can be restricted by the fact that there are not enough offers and not enough alternatives to work with. And that's why Fediverse is supported by so many data protectionists, and even me as being a data protection commissioner, I've had my authority set up a dedicated instance for Mastodon server, just to give these alternatives, because this is what really helps people to use their freedoms. Although this is not directly part of the task of a supervisory authority, it has helped to give citizens more freedom of choice when searching for adequate social networks. And so I think we have to look at this way. Second thought about this, Fediverse needs more stability because the servers are not operated by one operator, but by very different operators who might end their engagements for various reasons. And that's why it's also valuable that agencies like the data protection authorities are involved in Fediverse, because they are able to provide this stability. And so if we get many operators, most of them, of course, from the civil society, and some from enterprises, some from governmental agencies or other public bodies, this will help to improve the stability of Fediverse being a real alternative.
I absolutely agree. And I think that's actually what a few of the comments in the chat speak to this, right? Governments using the Fediverse, both bringing stability to it in some instances, maybe legitimizing it, but also to your earlier point, which I really, really liked, the idea that the people that are the biggest data protection advocates believe in this freedom and this of self-determination and freedom of information in a way that exists best in the Fediverse, right? To some degree, that is very consistent with the ethos of the Fediverse, and also can actually be expanded on within the Fediverse almost better than, you know, in a centralized system. So I think that's a beautiful kind of like acknowledgement, and frankly, something that freedom of information, self-determination. It is longer to say, but I think it's really more accurate in terms of what a data protection advocate and enthusiast, like many of us are, would want to share.
And if I may, oh, sorry, go Ivan.
Okay, I'll go really quickly. I think that for a lot of us on social networks, whether they're on the Fediverse or other places, we've come to really have bad privacy practices, you know, based on kind of privacy through obscurity, right? We're like, hey, what's the chances that, you know, my personal photo is going to be important for someone else and be abused or misused, right? And consequently, we maybe don't use privacy features that exist within the platforms that we use, right? So we may post something publicly when really it's something that should be private and intended only for a smaller set of people. So I think like one part of this, first of all, absolutely being choosy about the operator that you work with, having a relationship with that operator that goes beyond, you know, just finding them on the internet somewhere. So is it your city that you have a citizen relationship with? Is it a business that you are paying? Is it a family group or a association, something where you have some real connection? I think is going to be really important. Just having very loose connections, loose affinity, you don't get that same level of responsibility between the operator and the user. But I think the second thing is being aware of and using the privacy features that are built into our technology, not counting on privacy through obscurity, and really just like taking the steps necessary to turn on private posting and using those features.
And just also to comment on this point, which I think really refers to user empowerment, user awareness. Clearly, the Fediverse showcases a self-sorting behavior, with services choosing affiliations or exclusions, putting forward their moderation rules, their privacy sensitiveness, which gives to the users a real choice. And this is why I think it's a great evolution for data protection and privacy in general, and also the features that will be put forward in terms of restricting your content or the distribution of your content will be also something that will be taken into account by users when making their choice of instance. So overall, this is why it is clearly a very interesting evolution of social networks.
I agree. And I think one thing that we've seen even in the couple months that we've launched the Fediverse on Threads in a few markets is that we are seeing government entities, major elected officials opt in for Fediverse sharing, right? And I think that's in part for obviously the expanded reach, but that's also in part, another example I know is that in Brazil, a few months ago, I think maybe a month ago, their leadership, including their president, told everybody that follow them on X to follow them on Blue Sky, which is another federated app that uses a different protocol, not ActivityPub, but at the same time is in the Fediverse. Or part of the Fediverse, I should say. So I think there's a real kind of optimism and interest among government officials as well as agencies towards a decentralized social network where they can share their information and also confer with other similar kind of users. And what I think is interesting about today's conversation is I think that in some ways, the Fediverse is a direction that we kind of started the internet with, if you think about it, with URLs and email and things like that in a very decentralized way. We moved away from that direction over the last 10 to 12 years or so. And I now think that there's a little bit of like a turning towards, the best of both. There's one comment I do want to kind of speak to, and then I want to open it up to the questions that have been asked in the questions part of the tool. And if people could just take a second to go there and really kind of like thumbs up the ones that they would like us to answer, because I don't think we'll have time to get to all of them. But the one thing that I will respond to is, I think it was Darnell mentioned, that some of his relatives think that like the Fediverse is awesome and others think of it as a Facebook thing because now Threads is on it. I want to just take this question really quickly, because obviously we need to acknowledge the elephant in the room. The elephant in the room is that Threads does have, 100 million plus odd users. And I believe the Fediverse has sub 20 million users worldwide. So there's clearly like a difference in scale. Now, all 100 million Threads users are not public users. They're not all going to opt into this space. However, it is really important, and it was really important from us to not be seen as authoritative in the Fediverse. We are coming in as a participant in something that already exists. We've been engaging with the W3C, the original Fediverse developers like Evan and others to make sure that we're doing this in a way that is both collaborative, transparent, frankly, in our goals and our efforts. There's not a gotcha here. There's not a data grab here per se. This is really the numbers, and I think the numbers speak to that. This is an effort to respond to the push for interoperability in a way that makes sense and is consistent with an app that is new, but that is focused on public dialogue and real-time public conversation. And I think that while Threads is on it, we absolutely are not the ones defining what the Fediverse is. We don't, I've talked to Evan about this at length, but I think more resources out there explaining to people how the Fediverse works, who's part of it, giving a little bit more conceptualization to really what the Fediverse makeup is, will be helpful to offload this idea that Threads is here and that the Fediverse is somehow a Threads thing. It absolutely isn't. We don't see ourselves as being the ones developing it into the future. We really see ourselves as participating with the people that already are and offering how we can help and make it better for everyone. And so with that, I also agree with you, Darnell, that one great thing about the Fediverse is that there's always this geo block with China across all of our different apps, and the Fediverse kind of helps us get across that. I don't have any specifics on that at all. I don't know, Evan, if you do, but if not, we can turn over to the questions. Okay. So,
I don't. That's news to me, actually. I haven't effectively done that yet, so I'm impressed that Darnell's able to get it done.
So first, I just want to say thank you so much to our amazing speakers. This was a really fun kind of thing to put together and to work with Stuart from Privacy Law and Business and my colleagues at Meta, because one, we wanted to identify the right kind of expertise and make sure that we were covering a variety of expertise to talk about a subject area that I think is actually still, and to some degree, a question mark, not just for us as operators, not just for users, but also for policymakers and regulators. That there is this kind of interest in believing that the Fediverse can be a place for digital autonomy, as somebody said, right? And also that we need to square it with how GDPR is currently enforced and make sure that it can exist and continue to exist without extinguishing the kind of spirit of what the Fediverse serves to provide. And so with that, I thank all three of you for being here with us today. And one thing is, let me just see. Okay, so we don't have everybody for a long time. We have about 5 minutes to go, I think, with you, Evan. Are there any questions that you've seen that you want to answer? I know there's a question that kind of came up around government and government certification. And I think that I just want to make sure that I'm clarifying this question. It sounds like we all know the governments are able to join the Fediverse, but I think the question that Darnell, that you're asking is, would they create their own server, or would they join without, would they enter the Fediverse without just joining a platform that currently exists like Mastodon, WordPress, or Threads? Evan, you already responded to that. Is there anything in addition you want to say?
So there's nothing structurally that would keep, say, a government from operating its own services, even developing its own software in order to do this work, or, you know, as with the President of the United States, using a service like Threads to have the same effect. So I think that, you know, from different government levels, there are cities, states, and countries that run their own Mastodon servers, and there are others that have accounts on other Mastodon servers that already exist.
Fantastic, thank you. I think one more before you drop, because I'm conscious that you have to go soon, is Rupa's question around if these principles, and I imagine that they do, but if they apply in an enterprise scenario. I don't know. If so, in such scenarios, would individuals always be aware that information about them is being processed in the Fediverse? And then so let me go against the principle of empowering users. Go ahead.
Let me answer that question from my technological side, which is that enterprise social networks, enterprise social communication is something that's very big and important. A lot of us are used to having it within our workplaces. And part of the promise of the Fediverse is that those connections can extend beyond the organizational boundaries. So with vendors, with customers, with partners, I can be answering questions, I can be having positive conversations, or I can even be doing some marketing and outreach, right? I think the where I get less knowledgeable is in terms of what the responsibility of the enterprise is to their employees, as well as the operator to the enterprise and employees. So maybe I'll hand that one over.
Willy or Stefan, do either of you have I mean, I don't know that anyone necessarily has a take on the responsibility of the operator here, but maybe what we would hope the responsibility of the operator is to kind of maintain the user privacy that we're hoping for.
Yeah, exactly. And I don't think it would make things really different from what we see today. It is in line also with the responsibility of the data controller in the GDPR, setting. So yeah, clearly it would be the responsibility of each Fediverse operator to maintain the privacy of its users, but also the one of the users of third-party services, where it collects personal data from them.
And I think the other point that maybe we could share is that, you know, the empowering part is that users have a choice which server they want to be a part of. You know, I think right now, frankly, what we saw with Twitter is that users felt like, well, now we don't have any option. Where do we go? And the Fediverse is that option. But the Fediverse isn't a place that is controlled centrally, as we all know. It's a place where you can create your own server, or you could join someone's server. And so I think, Rupa, to your question, I think that the understanding should be that the individual server operator is the one that is responsible for providing that information, whether it's through their privacy policy that they have that a user can see before they sign up for any specific server, or in some sort of a covenant or their own guidelines. But if not, and if you decide that you find out something about that server that you've joined that is inconsistent with your understanding, I think, again, this goes back to the beauty of the Fediverse is you can leave and just go to another server. So I think that's how I would answer that. I am conscious that there was one question that was upvoted 6 times. So this is John's question, which is, and I think this is a great question to have both Dr. Brink and Willy answer. So one of the problems with consent is cognitive overload. And I actually just mentioned privacy policies and users having to, take on that responsibility. So I agree with you on this. So again, the cognitive overload of privacy policies and cookie policies we all accept on every website that we go to. Does the Fediverse generate the same kind of issue with respect to sharing posts?
Well, I fear it does. Yeah, we got this problem. It's a problem of using your data protection rights at all. It's a problem, as you mentioned before, problem of education, of awareness, and especially we didn't talk about this this afternoon. It's a problem because the internet is the era of many minors, and we of course have to think in a special way about the protection, data protection, and protection of rights of minors. So yeah, there's a problem with this, as you call it, mental overload, but this is not a special problem. For the Fediverse, it's a general problem, and all we can do, we talked about this before, is that we work even as data protection authorities in the education of the users, especially of the minors.
Just one point about the consent. When you look at the enforcement policy of EU data protection authorities and the EU the ECG, it is clear that collecting a valid consent is quite demanding, and there should be special attention when you rely on the legal basis of consent to comply with the strict conditions set out by the GDPR. And this is particularly the case where you also collect the consent with the view of communicating the data to other data controllers, where there should be some clarity and some information on the data controllers which will receive, the personal data. So this is, of course, something we have seen in other sectors, in the AdTech sector in particular, where there has been a lot of standardization, the finding of common solution to collect valid consent. There has been a lot of work with the TCF, for example, and probably we will see that in the Fediverse if the consent is considered the relevant legal basis. And we need to remind that this is not the only legal basis that may work. There are other ones. They need to be considered separately. And sometimes others are more appropriate than consent. So we need to remind this. Also, at the moment, what we see is that everyone is looking at new consent. Sometimes it's justified, sometimes it's not. And this will trigger a case-by-case analysis of what is the most appropriate legal basis, depending on the different data processing operations carried out within the Fediverse.
Excellent. I think I hope that answered your question, John, but I do think that both of those answers really shed light to this idea that there is consent, that there's, but consent should just be considered one of the ways that, there are other ways that we could make sure that users understand what they're engaging with, and that might be contractual necessity or legitimate interest as well. I think with that, we will conclude the Q&A, turn it back over to Stuart. Stuart, before I bring you back to, well, you're already on the stage, but before I turn it over to you, I just want to once again say thank you to both my panelists that are here, Evan that dropped, for their incredible expertise in this space. I feel very humbled to be on this with them and just learning from them. I'm also just going to thank everyone who has joined us today from all over the world. It's very exciting to see that there's this much interest in this topic, and we hope to provide more information going forward.
Great. Well, thanks very much. Thanks to you, Palak. Thanks to all the panel members. It's been a great education. We all now understand much more about the Fediverse and the privacy aspects and the challenges we have to face. We welcome everyone's feedback and ideas for future online events. We will let you know when the recording, we'll let everyone know when the recording is available, which should be in a day or so, and then you can review this again. Our next webinar is with sponsored by a major law firm, Latham & Watkins. That's on 16th of July on the UK-US data bridge, lessons from the first 8 months. And in brief, this was the UK-US data bridge, dates from October. What is it? How does it work in practice? And then how does it compare with the similar EU model that there is? And then before that, as I said, we've got our conference coming up in 3 weeks, just over 3 weeks, Valuable Data, Priceless Privacy, which continues to explore this tension with 30 sessions on all sorts of subjects, including one with chaired by Meta as well, and on the EU dimension. So we invite everyone to let us know if you'd like to team up with Privacy Laws of Business on this kind of event, either online or in person. And we look forward to keeping in contact with all of you with our reports, our news, and our other services, all on privacylaws.com. So that's all for now. We'll write to everyone to thank them again, so you'll feel very well thanked. And we look forward to keeping in contact with you. Thanks to our speakers, our audience, and it's goodbye for now.